Hi everyone and welcome. Today I'm going to talk about the 2021 new releases that I picked up over the course of the year and whether or not I would recommend them to you. So, over the last couple of months I picked up a total of 16 new releases and I am going to talk about 8 of them today. Then next week I am going to put out the part 2 of this video and I am going to talk about the 8 other ones. The main reason is that I still need to finish 2 of those books, but the other reason is that I do think that talking about 8 books in one video is going to be the sweet spot in terms of length, and that talking about 16 books in one video might make the video a little bit too long. Now, before we get into the video, I do want to preface this by saying that I was very excited for all of these. I don't go on a hunt for new releases per se. I was just genuinely hyped up for these because booktubers talked about it, I heard about it over on Goodreads, and I was actually thinking that all of these were going to be potentially new favorites. Fortunately, I DNF'd a couple, I severely disliked others, so that's definitely not the case. I'm not going to recommend all of these books. It's just the way it is, I suppose. Before we jump into it, I do want to quickly mention that if you're not new to the channel, you know this. I read fantasy and I read maybe a little bit of sci-fi, but that's it. And of the 16 books that I am going to talk about in total, 15 are adult fantasy and 1 is adult sci-fi. So if you're looking for literary recommendations, you're not going to find it here, but as a fantasy fan, I do think that I can give a fairly good impression of what these books are about and whether or not they are worth your time. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So first of all, I want to talk about 2 Greek myth retellings that I picked up fairly recently. The first is The Children of Jocasta by Natalie Haynes, and the second one is Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. This is a debut novel, if I'm not mistaken, and then of course Natalie Haynes is not new to Greek myth retellings. I think that this is her 3rd one, or it's even further down the line. At least this isn't her 1st one. Now, before we go into it, I do want to say that I just love myth retellings in general. Greek, Norse, it doesn't matter. And that's because of the very nature of Greek myth retellings often means that it's a character study of one of the characters in the original myth that wasn't really touched upon. Often they are just mentioned very briefly and that's about it. Often these are also women, so almost all of the time it's a feminist retelling of these women's lives, and that's just something that I like in general. If you know me, you also know that I love when gods interfere in the human realm, and of course, myth retellings, it's a given. And what I like is that this is often why it's called fantasy. You often don't have a magic system, you don't have a very magical world or anything like that. It's just the interference of the gods. And I do think that that's quite refreshing when you compare it to other fantasy novels. So what I want to say here is that I did love both of them, and maybe part of it is that I just love retellings. But other than that, I do think that both of them are worth your time. However, if you want to pick up one, I think that The Children of Jocasta is just a masterpiece. You can definitely see that Natalie Haynes is just a very talented storyteller. And in general, I love the story here. This is a retelling of Oedipus. I know the general idea of Oedipus, but other than that, I'm definitely not somebody who's very well known in Greek myths in general, and I like to go into a story blind. In this one, you follow 2 women. You follow Jocasta, who, when she was 15 years old, had to marry the king of Thebes. And then you also follow Ismene in a different point in history, and she is a princess of Thebes, and she lives in the castle together with her siblings. I had no idea how these 2 storylines were going to get intermingled. Around halfway through the book, I understood, and I thought that this was just done so well. I loved everything about it. I loved the writing style. I loved how easily everything was told. And just in general, I also loved the character study of these 2 women. So definitely a win for me. I really love this as just a new release, but I also think that this will make my top 10 favorite books of 2021. So I do think that that means a lot, especially because in general, I like Norse myth retellings more than Greek. And this is still going to make the list just because of how superb it was written. Then Ariadne, I think that this is a good book, but I don't think that it's anything special. I enjoyed it while I was reading it. I think that if you like Circe by Madeline Miller, this is very similar and you'll probably enjoy it as well. The writing style isn't as flowery as Circe, but it comes pretty close, so I do think that if you like the one, you will like the other. And in this one, you follow Ariadne, who is the sister of the Minotaur. Now, you also follow her sister, which I didn't know. Mainly you follow Ariadne, but you also follow the storyline of her sister. And in general, I quite enjoyed it, but I don't think that it gave me anything extra on top of just the original story, and it was a fun time while I was reading it, but it's not going to stick by me. I do think that, like I said, if you love Circe, you're going to like this one as well. Circe is the better read of the 2, and I also think that it is maybe quite comparable because if you're unaware, in Circe you follow somebody who has been cast on a deserted island and she needs to live there. And in this one of the two females that you are following has a very similar storyline. So for me it was fine, but neither the characters or the plot is something that I am going to keep with me and I am going to remember a lot of the times. So if you are somebody who loves Greek myth retellings, definitely pick up Ariadne because there's nothing wrong with it. But if you're somebody who just wants to try and see if it's something that's for you, then I do think that The Children of Jocasta is the better pick. Next up, I have again two books that are pretty well comparable to one another. I swear that I didn't really arrange these in pairs, but this is just the way that it comes up. The first one is For the Wolf by Hannah Witten. This is the first one in a new duology, the Wilderwood duology, and For the Throne, the conclusion comes out in June 2022, so it's almost there. And the second one is The Wolf and the Woodsman by Ava Reid, which is an adult fantasy standalone. Now, if you're not new to the channel, you know that I absolutely detest this book. I did finish it on audiobook, I don't know why. If I was reading this physically, I think that I would have DNF'd it pretty early on. I plowed through on audiobook and I regret that very much. That is time of my life that I will never get back. I know that a lot of people actually do love it. I just don't. In this one you follow Evike. Evike is a wolf girl, but unlike most of the people in her tribe, she doesn't have powers. Once every year, the people of the king come, the woodsmen, and they take one girl with powers back to the king. They don't really know what happens to this girl, but you can imagine that it's nothing good. Of course, this year, the people that live with Evike decide to betray her and they give her away to these woodsmen, even though she doesn't have powers. And the story begins. Something happens so that all of the woodsmen die, except for one, and then him and Evike need to travel together. You have an enemies to lovers trope that is handled very poorly. I don't like enemies to lovers, if anything, but here I don't think that it was handled well. You had enemies, 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 and then all of a sudden they were lovers, but she treated him like garbage, even though they were lovers, which I didn't like. I think that the author was trying to portray somebody with trauma and how she was not really ready to trust somebody, but I do think that they failed the mark. I think that this is something that's very difficult to do. She is a debut author, and I think that she bit off more than she could chew. In the end, you have an unbearable character. Not a character with trauma, in my opinion, just somebody who's unlikable. I don't think that anybody likes this main character, and neither did I. This was often compared to For the Wolf. I think that For the Wolf is better. Even though this looks like a Red Riding Hood reteller, it's more like a Beauty and the Beast retelling, where you follow the second daughter. And the tagline here is the first daughter is for the throne, the second daughter is for the wolf. So once every couple of years, I think every 12 years or something like that, the second daughter needs to be given to the wolf who lives in the woods. It's not a wolf, it's actually a man, because otherwise all kinds of creatures from the wood come and bad things happen. Everybody knows this type of story. It's actually very similar in terms of premise to Uprooted, but once you start reading more of it, it's actually very different from it. It's a very dark fairy tale, and I actually did love it. I don't think that it's going to make my top 10 or anything like that, but the romance was a lot better than The Wolf and the Woodsman, in my opinion, and the story was actually quite interesting. I loved the magic here, which was very nicely tied to nature, and I think that the writing style here was much better than The Wolf and the Woodsman. But in general, I just like this dark fantasy vibes. So if this sounds interesting to you, if you do like romance in your stories, if you are looking for a darker fantasy read, then I would definitely pick this one up. And to be honest, I know that a lot of people like The Wolf and the Woodsman, but I, in good conscience, cannot recommend that book to anyone. Then we have Hall of Smoke by H.M. Long. This is an adult fantasy standalone, and its companion novel, Temple of No God, actually comes out next year. And I do think that the series in total will have 4 standalone novels. So even though it's one series, it just takes place in the same world. Each of the books can be read as a standalone. In this one, we follow Nessa. Nessa is a warrior priestess, and when we meet her, she's actually in the woods being punished because she didn't follow an order of her goddess. When she returns to her village, she sees that everybody that she knows, including her husband, has been murdered, and she is taken captive. Now, I do think that this story is pretty Norse-inspired. We don't really see the Norse gods like Loki or Thor, but the gods that we do meet here remind me of them because they are so ruthless. There's also a lot of mystery surrounding the gods. Who are they? What are they? How did they become gods and how do they stay gods? What are their powers? And I really like that, and reading this book and getting to know more about these gods. Nessa is not the most fun character to follow, I suppose, because she is mourning the entire time. And if that's not even enough to deal with, she's also doubting her fate, and she is finding out more about her goddess. And like I said, the questions that we have while we're reading the book, this is something that Nessa is also asking herself. I do think that you can definitely see that this is a debut novel, especially towards the end. The ending is a little bit convoluted and confusing, and I think that it would have been better if you just have 50 more pages to explain it a little bit better. But in the end, I did really enjoy this first novel, and I am definitely going to read the companion. I would recommend this if you like Norse-inspired stories. I also felt that this was influenced by the Roman Empire, where you have the barbarians. Nessa might be one of those barbarians, and then you do have the legions of the Romans that play a role here. Like I said, it's influenced by them. They don't really call them Roman legionaries, but I did get that feeling the entire time, and also them worshipping different gods, which is something that happened between the barbarians and the Romans. So I quite enjoyed it because of that as well. And I do think that any of this, if it sounds interesting to you, you might like this book as well, but it's not very craftfully done, and especially the ending, you can see that it could have been improved if she had some more experience in writing, I think. But other than that, I would definitely recommend it, and I do think that we will see growth in her in that second book, so fingers crossed for that one. Next up, we have Sister Song by Lucy Holland. This is an adult fantasy standalone, and it's actually also historical fantasy because it does take place in early medieval England. I actually have a non-spoiler review where I compare this one to The Once and Future Witches and The Queens of Innisleer, because in all three of them you follow three siblings. In Sister Song, you follow three siblings who are also the daughters of the king. And it's very interesting to follow them, their wants, their needs, their goals, and how all of this is made more difficult because you do have the upcoming of a new religion, Christianity. This is actually personified here by a priest who lives at court and who is gaining more and more influence with the king, their father. To be more specific, one of these siblings is born biologically a girl, but they want to become king, they want to inherit from their father, and they are given a very difficult time from that priest. They are not allowed to wear men's clothes, and they are just not allowed to express themselves the way that they want to. So you definitely can see that things are going to take a turn for the worst, and if that's not enough, extra tension is added because you do have a stranger, Tristan, who comes at court. You don't really know anything about him, and you don't know if he is going to be good or bad. So throughout the whole book, you have that mystery and that tension that is building up. I actually really enjoyed this one. I would recommend this to anybody who thinks that nature-based magic is interesting, because you also have a druid-like character here, and just in general, if you like historical fantasy and those kinds of books that are pretty character-driven, I would definitely recommend this one. I do think that it's a little bit more difficult to get into because you are following these three sisters and it takes a little bit of time to warm up to them. But once you have, and once you are a couple of chapters in, I do think that you will have a good time, and I really enjoyed the conclusion of this standalone as well. So definitely recommend this one. Next up, I want to very quickly mention The Forgotten Kingdom by Sidney Pike, because yes, this came out in 2021, but this is actually a sequel. It's the second book in the Lost Queen trilogy. So you would have to read The Lost Queen first. But I do want to say that I do think that this is a step up from The Lost Queen, even though I loved The Lost Queen as well. This entire trilogy is historical fantasy, and it follows Langrod, who is the sister of the person on whom Merlin is based upon, who's called Lailaken. So in the first book you follow Langrod and Lailaken, but in the second book you follow their children and the next generation, while also still following Lailaken and Langrod. And what I really liked is that you have the Picts in this one. And I do think that most of it is very historically accurate. Of course, a lot of it is added, it is fantasy, but everything that is based on history is portrayed very accurately, and I just really enjoyed the second book. I do think that the third one comes out in 2023, so you do have to wait a while. But if you were on the fence of picking up the first book because you don't really know if the second one was any good, it was very good in my opinion. So yeah, definitely jump into the series if you haven't already. The last book that I want to talk about is The Goddess of Nothing at All by Kat Rector. This is a Norse myth retelling that I just recently finished and absolutely loved. In this one we follow Sigyn, who is one of the wives of Loki. Now, unlike most myth retellings, which are typically standalones, this is the beginning of a new series. I don't know how long the series will be, but I do hope very long, because I enjoyed this book a lot and I will definitely pick up the sequel as soon as it's released. So like I said, in this one you follow Sigyn. I think that Sigyn is, again, a character that in the original myths you don't really know a lot about her, except her small part that she plays in Ragnarok. But when I was reading this book, she felt like such a rich character that I just want to read more of. So I'm actually very happy that this is just the start of her entire story. Of course, we also get to see Loki in this book. He is her husband, and I really liked how he was portrayed. Of course, yes, Loki is a trickster and Loki is gender fluid, but in this book he also had a lot of depth, and I actually liked reading about him. What I liked a lot was that this definitely took a twist on the original myths, but on the beginning of each chapter you had just a couple of lines of how the original myths took place and how Sigyn and Loki were perceived by the other gods. And I just liked that you had that very big contrast between what was actually happening when you were following Sigyn and how this was being written down in history. So yeah, this is one that if you want to take just a couple of recommendations from this entire list, I think this is one that I would definitely recommend. If you like Norse myth retellings, you need to pick this one up. So these were the 8 new releases that I wanted to talk about first. I do hope that this video was helpful. Please let me know if you've read any of these and if you had similar feelings as me, or if you had a completely different understanding of the book. Also let me know if you were eyeing some of these already, or if you have some new books on your TBR, and maybe you have taken some off after hearing me rant about them. As always, I hope that you enjoyed the video, and see you next time. Bye!